Welcome to episode 54 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hey there. Hi there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode, new ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic for this episode. So for this week's featured topic, we found a study that's got some interesting info about cybersecurity employees, especially those working from home, their attitudes, and the impact on IT folks in terms of how this work from home environment has progressed really over the last year and a half. Don't know why they'd pick that sort of arbitrary range, but
what's changed in that time frame?
So yeah, what are some sort of key takeaways here? And I guess, where did this info all come from?
Well, I think the name of this survey, or I guess write-up on the survey, says a lot. It's called Rebellions and Rejections Report, and it kind of details from two sides of the same coin how remote workers and cybersecurity teams are handling all of this big switch to remote work in response to COVID. So, as you said, this is quite a big study that took in a couple thousand responses, I believe, which were done by a YouGov survey originally.
Yeah, in fact, it's a global YouGov survey, an online survey of 8,443 office workers who shifted to working from home, so very specific during the pandemic, and then also a global survey of 1,100 IT decision makers and teams, as well as analysis from Keppinger Cole, and a leading analyst in the space. And the whole report was put together by HP Wolf Security. So what was the first, I guess, number that jumped out at you?
Well, before we get into the numbers of this study, I want to touch briefly on a study that preceded it, also by Wolf Security, named Blurred Lines and Blind Spots, which reported 23% of office workers globally expect to work from home even after the pandemic is ended, with an additional 16% expecting to split their time equally at the office and working from home still. So that sort of sets the stage, I think, for what we're going to talk about here, as not only what they're currently dealing with, but this is obviously an issue that's going to continue into the future and needs addressed.
Yeah, something like a new normal, perhaps.
Right, yeah, if you have not heard anything of that. So I would say one of the big key takeaway stats here is a 54% number of office workers surveyed, specifically between the 18 to 24 age group, are more worried about their deadlines than they are about protecting the business's cybersecurity.
Yeah, and that's sort of an ongoing theme in a lot of the numbers that you see here. So there's a general concern that being secure and taking appropriate cybersecurity measures is going to slow down work, limit productivity, just generally frustrate employees who are working from home. And that's a pretty big number right there, 54%. Of course, that is a particular age group, but still, it's a big number one way or the other. The follow-on numbers there do suggest that other people think that security takes time, basically.
Right, and they kind of split these stats into two separate categories of apathy versus frustration. So in the apathy category, you'll see questions wherein the respondents are saying that they were not really trained in cybersecurity and they don't particularly understand how it works or understand why they need to care about it. Whereas on the frustration side, you have the parts of the question where they're actually being hindered in their day-to-day work. So 48% of that same age group, 18 to 24, thought that security policies are a hindrance to their work.
Yeah, pretty similar number. And the overall number is still pretty high. 34% of workers of any age say that security tools are more of a hindrance than a help. So still talking about a third here, and
right.
Not quite as bad as a half, but that's still a very significant chunk there when you extrapolate that all out. And so that's something that definitely seems like it would need to be addressed.
Right, and that kind of carries on further, that third that you sort of pointed out there. 31%, again, in that 18 to 24 age group, said that they have attempted to circumvent policy regarding cybersecurity. So not only is this a sort sort of festering problem of apathy and getting frustrated, but there are now actions involved of users at home outside of the view of IT that are starting to get frustrated to the point, well, they're going to skip right around IT security altogether and just take matters into their own hands.
Right. And that's that's definitely a problem if the security measures that your IT folks are putting into place are being ignored or worked around, because a lot of times those workarounds are what make you much, much more vulnerable as a company network. So also it takes time to circumvent them sometimes, depending on what the different measures are in place. And sort of going hand in hand with all of this, the idea that things are slowed down with security, the frustration, the circumvention is another set of numbers. 48% agree that these essential security measures result in a lot of wasted time working from home. 64% of those aged 18 to 24. And so then when you get to how much time, in fact, is being wasted in their minds, 82% of the people who think it wastes time say they waste 2 to 6 hours a month on onerous security measures, while almost a fifth, 18%, say they wasted more than 6 hours each month. So
yeah, and we kind of riffed about this in our free time before the show, but really reading this, I'm trying to rack my brain on what you could spend 6 hours per month on with security. I know two-factor authentication slows things down a little, and maybe you get some Windows updates now and then, but
yeah.
I can't think of any security measures even here at our network security company, which obviously we kind of take that serious, that would take me 6 hours per month. So maybe this is a perception versus reality kind of issue.
Yeah, or maybe it takes 6 hours to circumvent the security measures. But going back to that number, it was 31% of employees 18 to 24 who said they have attempted to circumvent the security measures. Still, 16% overall admitted to doing so as well. So again, not an insignificant number, obviously a pretty decent jump from that age group. But the fact that this attitude exists, it all goes back really, and this will bear out in some of the next statistics that we talk about. It all goes back really to that shift when everybody started working from home on almost overnight, really, back in March of 2020. And everyone sort of handled it a little differently, but the ongoing or overarching theme there was that people just wanted to make sure that people could work from home rather than making sure that all of the necessary measures were in place initially. Obviously, there's no time to cybersecurity train everybody right away at that point, and there are a lot of other scrambles that are taking place among IT staff and leadership at that point. But you got to think that that sort of might be the seed for this attitude here.
Right. And as we were talking about the training specifically, 6% of the global respondents said that they did receive additional user training on how to protect their home networks when they moved from the office into the home environment. So I guess the question is, are these people being set up for success in the first place, which, given the time crunch and what we'll talk about from the cybersecurity side of things, may not be the case necessarily.
Yeah, and that cybersecurity training number, the 36%, is quite an average, because you go as high as the workers surveyed in Mexico. Half of them said that they received some additional training. But in the UK, only 23% said that they had received additional cybersecurity training. So a pretty wide range among those two countries as an example. And we talk all the time about why training is important. We've even had some issues with people potentially rejecting training, but at least training is offered, and that's sort of an important tool.
Right. And so I guess the question is then, if we've gotten to this somewhat frustrating point from the worker's perspective, how did it get to that point from the perspective of the IT and network security folks that set this all up? And I think obviously the biggest answer there is going to come with the stat that expresses what percentage of IT teams believe that their security had to be sort of put on the back burner in lieu of business continuity. So basically, they said, all right, screw the network security. Let's just get people online as quick as possible so we can go back to selling stuff. And globally, 50% of teams found significant pressure to sort of prioritize continuity over security, while an additional 41% said that they felt some pressure. So doing a little bit of number crunching, that's a pretty high percentage together.
Yeah. It might take us a few minutes here, but I think the carry the 91%, yes, between those two numbers of IT folks said that they felt at least some pressure. So, yeah, that's very significant. And again, that sort of goes to planting that seed. If everyone first gets to jump on their home computer and just start doing stuff without having any procedures to follow, then they could get frustrated when all of a sudden there are procedures to follow to try and keep a business secure, but there is a reason why you need to have security in place. And so that then leads to another set of numbers from the cybersecurity folks surveyed, which is that 80% of IT teams surveyed reported that they had experienced pushback from workers who don't like controls being put on them at home. 18% said they experienced complaints from employees that legitimate work activity is being hampered or blocked by security policy or systems every day. 22% for every couple of days, and 27% weekly. So everybody's complaining, basically.
Everybody's complaining at them, and that all sort of aggregates into this 69% stat of IT security teams feeling that they're being cast as the villain in this whole scheme, I guess. So 69% of respondents on the IT security team side said that they were made to feel like they are the bad guys for enforcing these rules. So, as you said, when everybody first switched, it was kind of a big open Wild West, and then a new sheriff came to town, and everybody decided they don't like that sheriff.
Yeah. And the IT teams are sort of the easy scapegoat, even though they're just implementing policies to help the company overall. But then you go back to hearing about all of the cybersecurity workers being somewhat frustrated, and we're already lacking trained cybersecurity employees. So that's not really a big recruiting tactic to say, yeah, join our frustrated and battered team here.
Everyone you're trying to help will be angry at you. Join us.
Yeah.
So a significant number of office workers say they are feeling both disengaged and apathetic to their role in defending the business, while on the opposite side you have this group of IT professionals trying to, I guess, cheerlead and rah-rah get them back in the fight. So I guess the summation of all this is, where does the actual responsibility of resolving this sort of tension and friction lie? I believe this piece sort of lays that on the CISO.
Yeah, it lays it in a couple of ways. So CISOs, who they say are having more success in our current environment, are listening more to the employee end users, understanding how security impacts their workflows and productivity, and then reevaluating how it's implemented based on the needs of both the business and the employee. So that's obviously a start. You don't want to just mandate policies without taking any feedback on them. If you have a more collaborative approach, then the IT team is probably not getting as bombarded with complaints, but more suggestions and things that might not make them feel like they're doing something wrong.
Right. So there is a quote from the CISO of HP Inc., the group that put this study together, saying that cybersecurity needs to be something that everyone can buy into. And I think we've said something along those lines on our show, that sort of everybody has to be on the security team, so to speak, if you're an employee of the company. But here we are in this much harder to navigate environment and circumstances, and you can really start to see that some of these people working from home are saying, all right, well, how am I going to meet my deadlines and also participate on the network security department team at the same time?
Mm-hmm. And, the other sort of overarching idea here is embedding the cybersecurity into the DNA, is what they say in this report, of the organization. So that means if you are faced with a situation like what happened in March of 2020, that you already have measures in place that people are used to implementing in some way, shape, or form that would be able to happen right away there. Or if you do have to make any changes to accommodate a new work from home reality, that there's sort of an expectation that everyone is on the same page, that, oh yes, this may take a little bit longer, but we're doing this for the good of the company and the good of my coworkers. And it may be a slight annoyance, but it's a necessary annoyance, and I'm not going to complain about it to a survey.
Right. So I think you might be suggesting that compromise and understanding might do people well in this world. So can't argue with that.
Yeah. Just don't stay in your silo one way or the other. I mean, it's certainly on the employees to some degree to have some understanding of the situation, but it's also on each company to understand what the situation is for the employees to put them in their best place to succeed going forward. And again, taking that feedback and feeling like it's a back and forth, and then landing on policies, showing that you're making changes when changes are necessary or suggested strongly when there's a good point made by an employee that maybe this could change here or maybe this could change here. Just showing that collaboration, I think, makes a world of difference.
Right, and it seems the CISO is going to be that bridge, that man in the middle that kind of listens to both sides, considers all the options, and comes up with something that makes sense for everyone.
Because work from home is definitely still looked at as a vulnerability, and that's noted in this report too, pretty much across the board of the IT folks. They're concerned.
Right. I was going to say, speaking of that man in the middle, what kind of threats are the IT teams concerned about? That's actually part of this survey as well. I don't think these are particularly surprising stats myself.
No, they're not surprising threats, but they're threats nonetheless. And, quote, a ticking time bomb is one way that the work from home environment or remote work environment is been described in this report in terms of the possibility of threats getting through. So it's a top 8 list really on here, but we're talking about ransomware, firmware attacks against the endpoints, exploited vulnerabilities in unpatched devices, which will be a little tease for one other headline that we're going to hit on later. Data leakage, account device takeover, man-in-the-middle attacks, as you mentioned, IoT threats, targeted attacks, and firmware attacks against printers. So both printers and computers and PCs. Yeah,
I have a feeling that printers one snuck in there with the recent news targeting printers, but otherwise might not have made that list.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that as a major concern before, but it sets the stage for why this is such a big deal, getting that security implemented in such a way that your organization can feel comfortable, but again, keeping the end user in mind too.
Right. So in summation, I think H.P. Wolf kind of concludes it all pretty well when they say that CISOs will need to learn to start using their people skills, their communication skills, their negotiation skills just as much as they will their IT and tech know-how.
And you can find the entire report, because we've obviously not gone line by line here, but we will have a link in the description to this report. Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at the top stories in the cybersecurity world and talk about what they may mean to you. So let's start with headline number 1. Florida cyber grave robbers charged with condo collapse ID theft. A man and 2 women were arrested and charged with stealing the identities of 7 victims of the Surfside condominium collapse near Miami Beach this summer and attempting to obtain credit cards in their names. They're accused of taking the personal ID of 5 people who died and 2 who survived the collapse of the Champlain Tower South Tower in June.
Yes, the state attorney for Miami-Dade, that is Catherine Fernandez Rundle, said that these cyber grave robbers moved pretty quickly. So I believe the news was still coming out when this was all going down, and they were still looking through rubble for possible survivors. So this, as you said, the 2 women and 1 man who are named in the article, if you care to name and shame yourself, Kevin. It seems like not only were they after some of the people that died, as you said, as well as the survivors, and I believe at least the husband of one of the victims who was not himself at the condo at the time.
Right. Yeah. I'll go ahead and name names here. They're all in their 30s. It's 30-year-old Betsy Alejandra Cacho Medina, 34-year-old Kimberly Michelle Johnson, and 38-year-old Rodney Chute. They face multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. The fraudulent transactions allegedly valued up to $50,000. Basically, they used the ID of those people to obtain credit cards and to make fraudulent transactions with them. They allegedly used vacant residences as drop-off boxes for the delivery of those victims' credit cards.
Right. One of the quotes from the Attorney General says that the investigation shows that these individuals were highly skilled identity thieves, specifically because other than the names of the victim, almost nothing else on the credit information seems to be true. So I'm not quite sure how that passed all the credit checks.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you almost envision a situation, we talked about how quickly quickly they acted. It's almost like they have sort of a control center or something, and they're monitoring the news for these types of situations that may come up and then take advantage of them. I mean, the fact that they sort of seem to be a well-oiled machine in terms of how they were able to turn this sort of tragic event right into personal gain. It seems like they might have done this before.
Yeah, and really makes you wonder if all you need is a name to get all these credit cards set up. Why are all these hackers out here trying to breach everyone's confidential information? Just pull out a phone book, you win.
It almost reminds of back in the day, an old Simpsons episode where Bart uses the name of his dog to get a credit card, and all he basically did was put the dog's name in there and make up a few bits of personal information, and boom, credit card in the mail.
Well, depending on what the limits are, these folks probably will stay in jail for a while. So the largest bond set was up to $1 million, and the smallest bond given out to shoot was $430,000. So anywhere from 10 to 20 of these credit cards at the $50,000 limit, they can buy themselves right out.
And so the investigators allege that the scheme began in early July. So they identified likely the people that they wanted to use, and then started to make calls to financial institutions claiming to be those deceased victims to then request the replacement credit cards, which were then again sent to designated sort of empty addresses. And you mentioned the husband of a deceased victim was also targeted, allegedly. The investigation involves not only local law enforcement, but U.S. Marshals, Secret Service, Postal Inspection Service, and it is still ongoing. So Fernandez-Rundle, the attorney, says that more victims and suspects could emerge as well. And for those who may have forgotten about this one, this was a pretty big story. Nearly 100 people were killed when the 12-story condo building came down early in the morning of June 24th. And I don't know about you, but when I saw June 24th, it felt like it had happened a lot longer ago than that.
The time of this summer there's been a lot going on.
There has, yeah. So the cause of that one's still under investigation. But the other point I wanted to bring up as we close out this particular story is the terminology used by the prosecutor, cyber grave robbers. It sounds like a term that would have been used before, but I actually Googled it, and it looks like this prosecutor actually coined the phrase. And so it'd be interesting to see. I mean, obviously, this type of crime has occurred before, maybe not so much documented on the cyber side of things, maybe, the more traditional old methods, but you got to think this crime has occurred a number of times before. And I think,
now, do we have a name for it?
Yeah, it's a pretty apt description. So, you hate to think about the fact that the victims' families have to look out for something like this after the fact. And you wonder exactly what this ends up affecting in terms of credit ratings, and do the companies try to come after family members for unpaid charges, things like that. So it's another thing you got to watch out for when you're not really wanting to think about stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely not in the correct headspace to have to then take extra steps to protect yourself.
Now, headline number 2. Yandex pummeled by potent Meris DDoS botnet. It's a little bit of word salad coming out there, but so this is a little bit different angle on our typical Russian cyber attack story, because we're usually just talking about cyber attacks potentially or directly coming out of Russia. This one is a cyber attack on a Russian interest.
Yeah, this is one you don't hear too much news about, whether that be sweeping it under the rug or maybe it just doesn't happen. But in this case, it did. So this was targeting Yandex, which I believe is sort of like the Russian version of Google, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too. I mean, there are certain countries where Google is actually either not allowed or just not prevalent, and so there are these other search engines. China obviously has its own more prevalent search engine as well, but I had not heard of Yandex before.
So Yandex was targeted by a DDoS attack, the technique specifically called HTTP pipelining. So basically you send a browser request to a certain server, in this case Yandex, obviously. And before that server has a chance to even respond, you send multiple follow-up requests, basically clogging up the pipeline so no one else can get in and out either.
And that happened using a botnet, which is the typical method to accomplish a DDoS attack. And the botnet is named Meris. I'm pronouncing it that way because the way that it's written actually has like the long E symbol on it. So I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. It's a pretty good indicator, I would think. But this particular attack, according to the Curator blog, was the largest attack ever spotted, peaking at 21.8 million requests per second from August 29th to September 5th. By comparison, Cloudflare's largest ever recorded was on August 19th, so only about a week before, with 17.2 million requests per second on a different attack that had also been linked to Meris. So they're a pretty heavy hitter.
Yeah, this is breaking some records. So researchers believe that this botnet can be composed of up to about 250,000 infected devices. And basically it targets the layer 2 tunneling protocol tunnels. So this is for things such as VPNs and network app services. So creating two secure tunnels between one network and another. And as one of the researchers said, this is not just a bunch of IoT devices out there like thermostats and microwaves that got hacked, but these are actual network devices with an Ethernet connection.
Yeah, hardwired Ethernet connection, not even Wi-Fi devices. So these are networked devices. These are more, computers, things like that are legitimately being used for more complicated matters. So it is something that we talk about a lot, especially in this day and age. Botnets, we do think more of the IoT devices composing those botnets, but this one going the old fashioned route, which, probably does allow for more firepower when these devices are being used for ill intent. But that's interesting. And you talked about how this attack occurred. Interestingly enough, it was a 2018 vulnerability that was exploited that was patched by the company that discovered the vulnerability back in 2018, but apparently only 30% of vulnerable modems have been patched even nowadays. So that seems like that leaves a lot more that haven't.
Yeah, they left approximately 200,000 routers vulnerable to attack. These are business grade routers. So this is not just small home office or private use type stuff. So these are pretty complicated machines. And as you said, a patch was released over 3 years ago. But as we know with patches, they're not always easily added by everybody under the sun. So as you said, only about 30% of the people that were vulnerable actually got this fixed.
Yeah, so I mean, there are explanations for why, a lot of people have network devices that maybe are not following them very closely or following the landscape very closely. We actually talk about our managed services as being a way that people are able to follow that a little bit better because, having somebody who is paying attention all the time will allow you to get those patches done without you having to do all of that heavy lifting and paying attention constantly when you've got other things to pay attention to. But this is a sort of a prime example of where if you are not paying attention to patches and things like that or unable to install those, then you're really setting yourself up for potential catastrophe.
Right. There's a lot of firmware updates out there, and if you're not set up to have that automatically taken care of, I would certainly suggest hiring somebody that will. The one bright side to this Meris attack is that none of these devices were spoofed in any way as far as IPs. So if you are able to find the original source of these attacks, you should be able to block it out, right? Because it'll be the exact same set of IPs and signatures in the next attack. There's no spoofing going on. This is just, here's the network, block it if you can.
Yeah, and we should mention the devices that are affected here are MikroTik devices, and it's a pretty simple fix right now. Obviously, things could evolve going forward, but, patch them and blacklist the source of these zombie devices, and you're putting yourself in a pretty good position to stay secure here. But yeah, massive DDoS attacks, and we talked about them setting records. The one last bit in this piece, the researchers involved here actually think that these are precursor attacks, small precursor attacks by the threat actors who have created this Meris botnet. So just a little taste basically of what they are capable of. So that means I think I'd be rushing to take those steps to close up those loopholes right now.
Yeah, I wonder how they determined that these were just little, I guess, warning shots or tests, as they said. Maybe, I guess, they didn't see any real motive or anything stolen per se. So it very well could be, but I guess we'll just have to sit and wait and see who's targeted next and then try to figure out the why afterwards.
Now, headline and number 3, Chris Inglis scopes out cyber turf. So in our last episode, we discussed a bit the nation's newly created National Cyber Director position and the person occupying it, Chris Inglis. And this article takes a closer look at what the role will entail straight from the mouth of Chris Inglis.
Yeah, so this article specifically focuses on, I guess it was just a talk that he hosted at the Reagan Institute, where he sort of talked about the roles and the delegation and division of labor, so to speak, between his new, I guess, committee, you might call it, versus the National Security Council, as well as CISA. So where exactly his responsibilities will start and end is still being felt out.
Yeah, so just taking you back, this was a position that was just created this year, confirmed by the Senate in June, was Inglis into this position. So he is the first person to hold it. And Mariam Baksh, who joined us in our last episode, was talking about the fact that he sort of can kind of be the buck, where the cybersecurity buck stops in the White House, because it is an almost cabinet level type position, I think. So, Inglis said the good news is there's plenty of opportunity and plenty of challenge to justify 2 or 3 or 10 roles. And his responsibilities will principally be inside cyberspace. So he's not planning to step out of that lane when it comes to these other agencies that have toes in the cybersecurity game, too.
I feel like that quote is something you say to be as optimistic as possible when you are so optimistic about what you found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's plenty of opportunity. So that's so Inglis in his talk alluded to a cybersecurity event that took place at a federal agency, which he is not at liberty to discuss, but he talked about it as a potential, or I guess hypothetical, case study that helped line up where his responsibilities would end or begin in a similar type of attack.
Yeah, hypothetical, not so hypothetical in that apparently it's something that really happened. So at least the way that this is described, it sounds like it was a cybersecurity event, but interesting. Yeah. So anyway, he said, let's say in the recent few weeks that an agency within the federal government experienced some event in cyberspace attributable to something that a transgressor did. You need to start using transgressor a little bit more instead of bad actor or threat actor, I guess, right? That's a pretty good one. Got inside the system, began to do some lateral movement inside that system. It's clearly something that has to be addressed, but it's entirely contained within that system, he says. So at that point, you would expect that the on-scene manager, the CISO, I should say, of that agency to do what they should do, raise their hand and say, I've got an issue over here on this edge of the enterprise. So he said such an event would involve support from CISA, but not necessarily the National Security Council. So in that case, he says you don't have to call the NSC into play because it's entirely constrained within that space, but you do need to be mindful that the situation could grow.
Right. So it sounds like if this type of attack did jump to other agencies and it became a more widespread problem, then you get the NSC involved. But if it's just one system, then CISA can handle it.
And so it almost seems like he is sort of going to be the arbiter of when these other agencies, when things sort of overlap into other agencies, and when to bring everybody together and when to just sort of monitor and try to knock something out in a sort of contained manner in this case.
Right. And since it is week 1 for the NFL, we did go ahead and get a football reference in here from Inglis himself, saying that his space would be as more of an on-scene leadership role, or coach, as you might call it, whereas the CISA director will serve as the on-the-field quarterback. So doing the actual playmaking and more calling audibles and, being in the huddle, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. He said that in the event of a cyber attack with widespread consequences, consequences, like the Colonial Pipeline attack that we had earlier in the year. The Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber would take the lead, coordinating diplomatic, legal, and military response. So basically, the way he outlines everything here is that it's a case-by-case basis. And yeah, he's using sort of the analogy of maybe him being the coach, but it's almost more like the general manager or the commissioner in a way over these groups to sort of coordinate how this big federal government responds each time something does come up.
Yeah, so this is also just in general kind of a big government story here. So baby steps. They've made the commission. Now they're slowly but surely figuring out what it will do.
Right. And, it's good that there's already some idea of what that is. And again, going back to our last episode, I think that a lot of it is a lot of showing this priority for cybersecurity that's been sort of surging in the federal government. This position is sort of a way to show that a little bit more, and having somebody with cybersecurity focus that's going to be working more directly with the president instead of a couple of layers below is probably a good thing for, the next time a big cyber attack comes up.
Right. And I have a feeling this is going to stay in the news and continue to develop on multiple fronts, this whole cybersecurity and governmental oversight story. So I'm sure this is not the last time we'll speak on this.
Right. The government we've talked about in the last couple of years of doing this podcast, how when issues have come up, the federal government had not really had much in the way of policies in place for cybersecurity. They do have people dedicated to dealing with cybersecurity, and CISA was actually a fairly newly created arm of the federal government too already. So the fact that there is sort of an infrastructure being continually added to at this point, we've definitely not heard the last of Mr. Inglis, I think. And hopefully we don't hear it in relation to another major cyber attack, but there's definitely a lot to follow here.
Now, headline number 4, I guess we'll call it. We don't usually do 4 headlines. If you're a regular listener, we're normally just at 3, but this one broke right before we were about to drop the podcast, and it sort of ties back to a story that we talked about a couple episodes ago.
Really? You could say there's nothing we could do to stop this one from coming back up.
We didn't have to click or anything. It just happened. So a cyber surveillance company based in Israel developed a tool to break into Apple iPhones with a never-before-seen technique that's been in use since at least February, according to Citizen Lab. And so that led to Apple fixing the vulnerability in a rather abrupt, surprising software update this week as we record this.
Right. So as you said, we've talked about this one before. This is the NSO Group's Pegasus software. This is I guess you would call it malware, that you don't actually have to click or do anything in order for it to get onto your device. So pretty vulnerable. Apple has new iPhones being released soon, and they're going to be sharing those with the public with a large emphasis on security. So the timing of this, can be better or worse, I guess, depending on whose perspective you got.
Yeah, as we record this, I think it's either today or tomorrow that Apple is doing a rollout of their new iPhones, which will have a new iOS. But for all of the other ones that are a new version of the iOS, rather, but for everyone on the current and previous versions of the iOS operating system, a little bit of danger there. But the head of Apple Security Engineering and Architecture said, after identifying the vulnerability used by this exploit, which affects iMessage, which we'll get to in just a second, Apple rapidly developed and deployed a fix in iOS 14.8 to protect users. Attacks like the ones described are highly sophisticated, cost millions to develop, often have a short shelf life, and are used to target specific individuals, which again goes back to that original story that we talked about with Pegasus software sort of, I guess, allegedly being sold to despotic regimes.
Yeah, so Citizens Lab actually found this first iPhone version of Pegasus on a Saudi political activist's device. So, as you said, it's been used for targeting activists, journalists, investigative reporters, things of that nature. And just the quote you said earlier sort of espouses that this is an hack that was highly sophisticated, targeted, cost money, time, effort to develop, and it was a purpose-built weapon rather than just a ransomware as a service kind kind of throw it out there and hope for the worst.
Yes, and this head of Apple security also mentions that because they're so targeted, most people are not going to be faced with these, but you want to make sure that your users aren't potentially faced with them. And so this does tie in. We call this a zero-click vulnerability because, as you said, you don't do anything. You just have a phone, and you may have
where you messed up.
Yeah, there's your problem right there. Go off the grid, and you won't have to worry about it. But it has to do with iMessage. So the vulnerability lies in how iMessage automatically renders images. It's been repeatedly targeted by NSO and other cyber arms dealers, and updates have already been done by Apple, but apparently still some vulnerabilities lie unfound at first.
Yeah, and an Apple spokesperson told the New York Times that they are planning to have some additional barriers to spyware of this nature added to their next software update due out later this year. So I would guess this is a sort of staggered updates that we'll be seeing roll out after the initial release of the iPhone.
And in terms of the spyware, what it does, I mean, basically they can see everything that you're doing on your phone. Yep. So, yeah, if you are a target, then that can be pretty scary. And hopefully this ties up the loose ends. And it also makes you wonder, I mean, we're obviously talking about Apple right now, but people have other types of phones too.
Windows, Google.
I mean, mostly BlackBerry, Android outside. Right. Yeah. Don't know how many people still have BlackBerry, but I'm sure there's somebody out there hold out, right? But yeah, with the Android OS and the fact that you have iMessage being spotlighted here, obviously a lot of other messaging apps are out there, and you wonder if those may share some of those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so Steve Turner, an analyst with the tech consulting firm Forrester, was quoted saying that users of mobile and computing platforms need to make checking for security updates a part of their weekly, if not daily, routine, which isn't going to go over with those people that got surveyed about being bothered by security measures. But
that'll take them an extra 6 hours right there.
I'm about to say, add that to your daily coffee.
But yeah, I mean, that's what it is. We underline this a lot as a security measure. You got to make sure that your devices are all patched. We just talked earlier on in this episode about a number of people not patching a vulnerability that was found 3 years ago. So
yeah, hopefully more than 30% of iPhones will get this fixed.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode of Paying a Firewalls.com podcast. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to get secure.
Stay secure.